The auditorium smelled of polished wood and fresh ink, yet the scent did nothing to lift the weight that pressed on him. At the center of the stage, rows of graduates shuffled in their crisp gowns, their laughter bouncing off the high ceilings like a symphony of triumph he could no longer hear. He sat alone, a chair at the very edge of the hall, rigid, unbending, and paralyzed. Paralyzed, not just in body but in spirit. The room's energy, a tide of expectation, accomplishment, and celebration, washed over him, and left him stranded on a rocky shore of helplessness. The irony was cruel. The same mind that had built empires, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and navigated cutthroat boardrooms, was now trapped in a body that refused his command. He looked around, and all he saw were people moving, parents beaming, friends hugging, cameras flashing, degrees being thrust into eager hands, and yet no one noticed him, not really, not the faculty, not the families. Even his closest peers, once allies in ambition, glided past as if he were already invisible. A single thought clawed at him, sharper than the ache in his muscles. Was all that effort meaningless? Then she appeared. A mother, not a celebrity, not a titan of industry, just a woman who carried herself with a quiet certainty that came from experience, rather than acclaim. She walked slowly, deliberately, weaving through the crowd that had been blind to him. She did not rush, did not hesitate. Her gaze found his immediately, and in that instant, the entire hall, the pomp, the ceremony, the pompous applause faded into the background. She didn't know it yet, but her single step toward him was about to flip the entire outcome of his life. A single act, invisible to most, would ignite a transformation few could have predicted. Here's what that moment teaches us. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the weight of entire universes. A hand extended, a glance, a single word of acknowledgement. They can break through isolation that no strategy, no money, no prestige can reach. He had spent decades preparing for life's grand stages, conference rooms, international negotiations, high-stakes mergers, but none of that prepared him for the simplest, yet most profound human act: being seen, truly seen. And now, in a room buzzing with achievement, the paradox was unbearable. He had everything on paper, yet in this moment, with the world moving on without him, he understood how fragile success could be when the foundation of human connection is absent. As the mother approached, a ripple of curiosity passed through the spectators nearby. Some frowned, some whispered, but she remained unmoved. She stopped just short of his chair. Her hand hovered in the air, uncertain whether to rest it on the back of the seat or to simply offer the warmth of proximity. Then, finally, she spoke. Not loudly, not with grand pronouncements, but with a tone that carried both empathy and authority. A tone that said, "I see you, you are here, and your story is not over." A single action flipped the entire outcome. In that instant, the room seemed to pause. Even the most polished graduates, the most confident parents, the most composed faculty, unconsciously, collectively, they sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding. Not a spectacle, not a performance, something deeper, a turning of tides. He lifted his eyes to meet hers, and in those seconds, before words fully formed, a seed of resolve planted itself in his mind, a whisper that would grow into a roar. This is not the end, not yet, not ever. And just like that, the stage was set, not for applause, not for recognition, but for a transformation that would redefine the measure of power, resilience, and human brilliance. But the question lingered, heavy and urgent: could he rise from this place, from this paralysis, and reclaim not only his life, but the very essence of his purpose? The answer would not come easily. In fact, what came next would test every limit, every expectation, every ounce of strength, physical, mental, and moral. In that moment, the quiet, almost invisible gesture of a single mother was the first thread in a tapestry of redemption that no one, not even he, could have anticipated. To understand the gravity of his solitude at graduation, we must go back, years before the applause, the boardrooms, and the headline-grabbing mergers. Back when ambition was a seed, planted in a soil often unkind, watered with expectation, and fertilized by resilience born of necessity. He grew up in a neighborhood where ceilings were low, and opportunities were often invisible, the kind of place where people whispered about potential but rarely invested in it, where talent had to fight tooth and nail to be seen, let alone nurtured. Systemic barriers were as real as the streets he walked: underfunded schools, biased assessments, invisible ceilings that dictated how far someone like him could rise. But he had brilliance, not the flashy, immediate kind that draws attention at first glance. No, he had the patient, calculating intelligence that thrived in the shadows. He studied hard, absorbed knowledge, and moved strategically. Yet, even as he excelled academically, socially, and eventually financially, he carried an invisible weight, a persistent doubt from the world, whispered or unspoken, that someone from his background could never truly belong among the elite. That doubt became a quiet companion. It haunted meetings, interviews, even celebrations. Every deal, every accolade came with a silent reminder. You don't belong here. One misstep, and they'll remind you why. The world had conditioned him to perform, to overcompensate, to anticipate every subtle insult and every structural disadvantage. And then came the accident. One moment, a life of relentless upward motion. The next, immobilized, confined to a body that refused cooperation. The irony was almost unbearable. A mind honed to command, a strategist capable of moving continents with a plan, rendered powerless in the most basic physical ways. It wasn't just the paralysis, it was the narrative that came with it. Society's response was predictable: whispers of pity, awkward glances, and a subtle, almost imperceptible distancing. Colleagues no longer saw the genius behind the paralysis. They saw a vulnerability they were uncomfortable confronting. Family, friends, even mentors. The pillars he had once leaned on struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the body before them. And yet, he didn't internalize all of it. He had cultivated resilience from the start. But resilience alone is not enough. When the world consistently reminds you of your limits, he had to fight not only the physical reality but the psychological weight of irrelevance. Every day became a negotiation between hope and despair, determination and resignation, pride and humility. In this crucible we see the root cause of the moment at graduation, not the paralysis itself, but the layers of systemic neglect, bias, and personal sacrifice that had brought him to a point where success, for all its material symbols, felt hollow. Here's what we must understand. The obstacles were never just external. They had a way of burrowing inside, shaping perception, altering judgment, and conditioning responses. His isolation at graduation was a culmination of years spent fighting against forces both visible and invisible. Every slight, every overlooked achievement, every door closed or delayed, these were threads woven into the fabric of his solitude. And yet, even in these darkest layers, a hidden intelligence persisted, a core of strategic thought and emotional acuity that, if awakened at the right moment, could turn the narrative on its head. She didn't see a broken man, she saw potential waiting to be reignited, and he, though he didn't yet realize it, was about to be reminded of a principle that had always guided him. Though now buried under despair, intelligence is never lost. Even when the body falters, the mind can navigate the impossible. But before that could happen, he had to face a moral and emotional crucible, one that would force him to confront not only the injustice around him, but the truths within him. And that brings us to the next pivotal moment, the moral fork in the road, where the choice between surrender and resurgence would define the trajectory of his life, and the lives of everyone around him. The hall was silent now, the echoes of celebration fading, leaving only the sound of his own breath, and the relentless ticking of time. In that stillness, he faced a question far heavier than any corporate decision, any calculated risk he had ever taken. Do I give in, or do I rise? This was the moral fork in the road, and unlike any boardroom scenario, the stakes weren't measured in dollars or market share. They were measured in identity, in dignity, in the unspoken truth that the world's judgment does not define him, but his response to it does. On one path lay surrender, to remain in the shadow of paralysis, to let disappointment shape him, to allow resentment and bitterness to fester. It was the easy choice, the human choice, a path lined with self-pity and social invisibility. Many would not blame him, many would even expect it. Yet the alternative path demanded courage the world could not quantify, to fight not just for mobility, but for mastery over circumstance, to reclaim influence, not through brute force, but through strategy and insight, to turn a personal tragedy into a public lesson in resilience and leadership. Here's what that moment teaches us. Life rarely presents options as victories or failures. It presents them as moral decisions, and the right choice is often the one that is hardest to see, hardest to execute, and hardest to believe in. He thought of every moment that had led him here. The neighborhoods that underestimated him, the schools that dismissed him, the corporations that ignored his brilliance. Each slight, each systemic barrier, had carved into him a capacity for empathy, strategic thinking, and unshakable focus. And yet, despair whispered, no one will notice your effort, no one will remember your victories, even your closest allies will move on without you. It was in that whisper that the true test arose. She didn't say anything yet, she simply waited, her presence a silent challenge. The question hung between them, heavier than the air in the room. Will you let life define you, or will you define life? A single action, he realized, would flip the entire trajectory. A choice, quiet, internal, invisible to the casual observer, would determine whether he remained a casualty of circumstance or became a strategist of his own destiny. And then he remembered a lesson from years past, from mentors who had guided him through corporate battlegrounds and personal trials. Your response to adversity determines your authority over life, far more than your current condition ever could. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the paralysis that had restrained his body, but not his mind. In that pause, clarity emerged. The path of surrender may have been easier, but it carried nothing that mattered. Only the path of deliberate action, of calculated resilience, of strategic courage, promised transformation. She didn't know it yet, but that small deliberate step toward him had done more than offer empathy. It had created a mirror, a reflection of potential. And in that reflection he saw not a man trapped by circumstance, but a man who could rewrite the rules of engagement entirely. And in that moment, a seed of resolve took root. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably real, the decision to rise, to move forward, not just physically, not just socially, but strategically, morally, and emotionally. Yet the challenge was far from over. Choosing to rise was only the beginning, for every path forward is littered with obstacles, some visible, some hidden, some orchestrated by the very systems that had brought him low. And those obstacles would come quickly: public scrutiny, skepticism from peers, internal doubt. The first of many trials awaited him, testing not only his intellect, but his resolve. The question now was not if he could rise, it was how he would do it, and that answer would require more than courage. It would require the awakening of hidden power, intelligence, and strategy that had lain dormant for too long. The auditorium lights flickered softly over the polished floor, but in that quiet glow he began to see something that others had never noticed. The power that had been inside him all along, not in his muscles, those were no longer reliable, but in his mind, his insight, and his capacity for strategy. For decades he had been underestimated. People had looked at his youth, his background, even his calm demeanor, and dismissed the subtle genius beneath. But genius, he realized now, doesn't always announce itself with flash or spectacle. Sometimes it waits, patient and silent, until the exact moment when it can turn the tide. She had not arrived merely to offer comfort. She had unknowingly forced him into a mirror of his own potential. And when he looked into that mirror, he saw patterns others missed, the predictable behaviors of his colleagues, the hidden biases of the system, the vulnerabilities even in those who seemed untouchable. Here's what that moment teaches us. Brilliance often lies hidden, overlooked because it doesn't conform to expectations. The smartest moves are invisible until you recognize them yourself, and sometimes, adversity is the clearest lens for seeing what's been there all along. He began to recall the foundations he had built over decades. Networks carefully cultivated, relationships forged in trust, a mind trained to anticipate outcomes before they materialized. Even while paralyzed, he could plan, he could analyze, he could strategize. For the first time in weeks, a small reversal of power emerged. His paralysis remained, but it no longer defined the extent of his influence. The room, buzzing with ceremony and unawareness, became his chessboard. Every glance, every reaction from those around him, was a piece to be studied, understood, and anticipated. She watched quietly, her presence almost imperceptible, yet catalytic. He didn't speak, but he moved mentally, rehearsing possibilities, testing outcomes, calculating risks. What others saw as helplessness, he saw as opportunity. She didn't know it yet, but the single step she had taken had unlocked more than courage. It had triggered strategic clarity, and in this clarity, he began to identify the first avenues of subtle power, the whispers of doubt among rivals, the overconfidence of competitors, the overlooked mistakes of those who assumed superiority. A single insight struck him. Victory would not come from force. It would come from precision, patience, and timing. Like a master chess player, he would maneuver silently, predictively, leveraging what others thought was weakness into his advantage. And he realized another truth. Hidden intelligence isn't just about solving problems. It's about seeing the narrative before it unfolds, about understanding the human elements that drive decisions, and about knowing when to act, and when to wait. That afternoon, as the ceremony continued around him, he began a silent climb, not publicly, not visibly, but in his mind, he plotted a roadmap of leverage, influence, and transformation. Every small observation became data. Every subtle gesture of others became information. Every misstep in the system became an opportunity. And in that quiet brilliance, he found a thrill he hadn't felt in years, the recognition that he was still the architect of outcomes, even when the body no longer obeyed. But the world was not finished testing him. As the first whispers of his newfound clarity began to emerge, systemic obstacles loomed on the horizon. Colleagues would challenge him, authority would question him, the very systems that had nurtured his isolation would conspire against him. Here's the truth. Intelligence alone is never enough. To wield hidden power, you must endure scrutiny, withstand humiliation, and transform adversity into action. And that was coming next. A public trial that would push him to his limits. Yet for the first time, he felt a surge of confidence. A spark. The knowledge that he had always possessed a tool more potent than muscles or mobility. The strategic mind of a true leader, waiting for its moment to strike. And that moment was approaching. The auditorium that had once seemed to hum with possibility now felt like a cage. The world's indifference and judgment no longer hovered at the edges, they pressed in, relentless and unyielding. Every glance from a faculty member, every whisper among graduates, every curious murmur from spectators felt amplified. He realized the stage wasn't merely a platform for celebration, it was a proving ground, and he was being tested in ways far beyond mobility. The first systemic obstacle emerged immediately. A prominent alumnus, someone he had once respected, now an invisible rival, made a public remark under the guise of encouragement. "We're all proud of those who can walk this stage themselves." The words stung, sharp and precise, cutting through the fragile veneer of composure he had tried to maintain. He had anticipated many forms of challenge, but not the subtle cruelty that could be disguised as civility. It was a humiliation designed to assert power, to reinforce hierarchy, and to remind him of the world's bias. A lesson he had known intellectually, yet now experienced in real time, painfully personal. Then came the practical obstacles. The ceremony was not designed for someone in his condition. The platform, the chairs, the flow of the program all assumed mobility. He struggled with minor adjustments, facing eyes that ranged from awkward sympathy to thinly veiled annoyance. Every small failure, every moment of visible struggle, was magnified by expectation. The audience's gaze, though often polite, carried the weight of judgment. She, the mother who had reached him, remained at his side, offering silent support, but even her presence could not erase the public scrutiny. And as he maneuvered through the ceremony, a visceral question gnawed at him. Can I reclaim authority over a world that seems determined to define me by limitation? Humiliation intensified when technology failed. The microphone he was meant to use for a brief address cracked and sputtered. Cameras angled awkwardly, capturing him awkwardly from the side, emphasizing what the world saw as weakness. He could hear the stifled chuckles, the polite coughs, the subtle shift of chairs, and in that moment, the weight of systemic neglect, the lack of accommodations, the absence of foresight, the implicit bias, hit harder than any physical challenge. And yet, beneath the humiliation, something else stirred: awareness, observation, strategy. He realized that every error, every public misstep, was not just a personal setback, it was a mirror reflecting the inefficiency and oversight of the system itself. The world had underestimated him, but now, it was revealing its cracks, and he could exploit them. Here's what that moment teaches us. Breakdowns are often opportunities in disguise. Systems that oppress can be studied, understood, and eventually transformed. But first you must endure the trial, feel the pressure, and absorb the public sting. It is in the crucible of exposure that resilience is forged. Even as humiliation threatened to collapse him inward, he noticed the micro-patterns, the rushed steps of the coordinators, the assumptions of spectators, the lapses in protocol. His paralysis prevented physical action, but his mind operated at full capacity, calculating leverage points, noting weaknesses, and planning interventions. And yet the public breakdown was more than physical. Emotional waves crashed over him. Doubt, frustration, anger, and vulnerability, mixed in a potent storm. He had always excelled in controlled environments. But control was slipping. To survive, he would have to tap into something deeper than intellect. He would need courage tempered by strategy, patience reinforced by focus, and presence fortified by moral clarity. And then came the internal realization: this breakdown, this moment of public exposure, was not an end. It was a pivot, a test not just of capability, but of character. Many would falter, many would shrink under the gaze of judgment and systemic bias. But he had chosen the path of resurgence, and resurgence demands endurance before reward. She didn't intervene overtly, she didn't need to. Her presence had reminded him of one truth that was now undeniable. Adversity could not paralyze the mind, it could not erase intelligence, and it could not prevent a man prepared to rise from seizing the first available advantage. The turning point was approaching, not yet victorious, not yet celebrated, but imminent. The small flame of strategic clarity, ignited by his hidden intelligence, fanned by resolve, and protected by observation, would soon blaze into action. And that action would begin quietly, subtly, but irrevocably. The humiliation lingered like smoke in the auditorium, clinging to every corner of his consciousness. He could feel the sting of judgment, the echo of whispered doubts, and the invisible weight of systemic neglect pressing on him from every direction. Yet, just as despair threatened to settle permanently, a subtle shift occurred, a moment so quiet, it could have been missed if not observed with absolute attention. She stepped closer, not with words of advice, but with presence. Her eyes held the unwavering certainty of someone who had seen life's complexities, and knew that insight, not speed, often determines outcomes. And in that gaze he recognized the spark of clarity he had been missing. Here's what that moment teaches us. Often, the turning point comes not with a dramatic event, but with a subtle realization that redefines your perception. The world's obstacles do not need to be destroyed. They need to be understood, anticipated, and strategically addressed. He recalled lessons from his mentors over the years, lessons buried beneath boardroom victories and corporate triumphs. Control the narrative. Observe first, act second. Leverage every asset, even those invisible to others. His mind raced, weaving a blueprint of action in a space where physical movement was limited. And then the insight crystallized. The path forward was not a head-on confrontation. It was a series of precise, calculated moves, leveraging relationships, knowledge and timing. Victory would be quiet at first, invisible even, but undeniable in its ultimate impact. She didn't know it yet, but her presence had unlocked not just courage, it had unlocked strategy. A single gesture, a single acknowledgement, had reminded him that influence is never entirely lost, even when mobility is. The tools of success, the network he had built, the knowledge he had acquired, the respect he had earned, remained in place waiting for him to activate them. A new mindset emerged. I cannot change what has already happened, but I can determine what happens next. In that clarity, fear lost its grip, replaced by anticipation. He began to see every minor setback, every systemic obstacle, every whispered doubt as a variable in a game he could still master. The turning point was complete when he made a single decision to transform vulnerability into leverage. To let the world see weakness, yes, but not as an end, rather as a stage for demonstrating ingenuity, resilience, and strategic brilliance. He began mapping his comeback, first identifying allies who had been overlooked, underestimated, or misjudged, people whose loyalty and insight could be quietly mobilized. Next, he examined the system that had humiliated him, uncovering its inefficiencies, contradictions, and vulnerabilities. Finally, he rehearsed the small, deliberate steps he would take to regain momentum, steps that would appear inconsequential to observers, but would compound into undeniable influence. Here's what that moment teaches us. True transformation begins internally. External victories follow internal clarity. And often the key to turning adversity into advantage is recognizing that the rules of engagement can be rewritten from the mind outward. She watched, unaware that she had become the catalyst for this awakening. A single hand extended in empathy had shifted the entire trajectory of his life. She didn't know it, but she had reminded him of a principle he had learned long ago, yet almost forgotten under years of struggle. Strategy, clarity, and patience are always more powerful than brute force. And as he began to execute this newfound plan, the first quiet victories began. Small wins, invisible to the world, but unmistakable to him. A conversation navigated with precision, a subtle shift in perception among his peers. A minor but critical leverage point activated. Each success built momentum, each step restoring agency and confidence. Yet the ultimate challenge loomed. The world would not yield without resistance. The public stage, the systemic pressures, and the skeptical bystanders would all test the durability of his strategy. The climb had begun, but the summit remained distant. And that's where the silent execution would take over. A methodical, deliberate ascent that would test patience, resilience, and intelligence before the grand reversal could unfold. The auditorium's echo of applause had long faded, yet he worked in silence. His body remained limited, but his mind operated at full velocity, plotting each move with precision. He had discovered the truth that many overlooked influence is not always loud. Sometimes it is invisible, accumulative, and unstoppable. He began by reconnecting with allies who had been sidelined, forgotten, or underestimated. A quiet message here, a subtle conversation there, no fanfare, no announcement, only intention and strategy. Each connection was like a thread woven into a growing network, a lattice of support that others failed to see. These were not mere favors, they were investments in a long game, orchestrated with patience and foresight. Here's what that moment teaches us. The climb is rarely spectacular at first. Silent victories, unnoticed by the majority, compound into influence that cannot be ignored. Timing is everything, and preparation determines the impact of every subsequent step. He also began studying the system that had humiliated him, observing protocols, internal politics, and human behavior with a detached, analytical eye. Every oversight, every inefficiency, every misjudgment became an opportunity. Inaction by others was not an obstacle, it was leverage. He recorded, calculated, and rehearsed, like a master strategist, planning a decisive campaign in the quiet of his own mind. She remained nearby, a silent anchor, not instructing, not commanding, merely present. She did not know it yet, but her simple act of acknowledgement had sparked a process that would ripple far beyond her awareness. A single step, taken without expectation, had catalyzed a series of deliberate, strategic actions that would transform his position entirely. And he began noticing subtle shifts. Colleagues who had dismissed him started to defer to his opinion, albeit unconsciously. The system that had once humiliated him showed cracks, and he quietly maneuvered into spaces where influence mattered most. Every small success built momentum, each invisible victory, reinforcing the idea that power does not need to be loudly declared, it only needs to be executed. During these silent maneuvers, he also cultivated his emotional resilience. He knew that the climb required patience as much as intellect. Every delay, every minor setback, every underestimation by rivals became data, not discouragement. The public would see only the result, never the meticulous preparation, the patience, the quiet precision. Here's what that moment teaches us. Transformation is rarely immediate. It is a series of deliberate steps, often invisible to the world, that eventually coalesce into undeniable force. The quiet climb strengthens character, sharpens judgment, and ensures that when the moment of revelation arrives, it is both strategic and inevitable. He rehearsed every possible encounter, every negotiation, every public interaction, and every calculated risk. Nothing was left to chance. Even as the world believed him powerless, he was building an internal momentum, a force that no misunderstanding, no systemic bias, and no public scrutiny could derail. The turning point had been his clarity. The climb was now his execution. And with every small deliberate move, he drew closer to the moment where the world would witness the reversal, not as luck or coincidence, but as the outcome of calculated brilliance. Yet, the true test remained ahead. Silent victories build the foundation, but public transformation demands timing, courage, and precision. The real reversal, the kind that reshapes perception, humbles adversaries, and reforms systems, was still to come. And in that quiet preparation, a profound truth emerged. The climb is never about proving to the world that you are capable. It is about proving to yourself that you never lost the power to act, the intelligence to strategize, and the moral clarity to rise. The auditorium was quiet. A few weeks later, though this time the air was different, the same people who had once dismissed him, whispered doubts, or glanced past him, now felt the tension of expectation without knowing why. Something had changed. He walked in, not with visible bravado, but with the quiet precision of someone who had mapped every variable, every observer, every potential reaction. She was there too, as she had been before, but now she watched with a subtle smile, sensing the shift even if she didn't yet understand its full magnitude. He had transformed not his body yet, but the narrative, the system, and the perception of power itself. He stepped to the podium, the microphone perfectly functional, the eyes of the audience fixed on him, but this time he did not stumble. He did not falter. He spoke with calm authority, every word deliberate, every pause strategic, and as he spoke, the subtle victories he had accumulated, the allies cultivated, the weaknesses understood, the silent observations began to manifest visibly. Here's what that moment teaches us. Preparation, patience, and silent execution turn invisibility into impact. By the time the world notices, the outcome is inevitable. He unveiled a new initiative, a project, a partnership, a vision, born from the very system that had humiliated him, and in doing so he exposed the weaknesses of the establishment that had doubted him. He highlighted oversights, corrected injustices, and demonstrated that intelligence, strategy, and moral clarity could overcome even the harshest systemic obstacles. Those who had doubted him watched in stunned silence. The alumnus who had once mocked him now struggled to maintain composure, realizing the scope of the oversight. Peers who had whispered questioned their assumptions, and the audience, initially skeptical, began to understand the subtle brilliance of a mind that had never stopped moving, even when the body seemed paralyzed. A single action, executed with precision, flipped the narrative. He wasn't just reclaiming his position, he was transforming the system itself. Policies, biases, and expectations were now being reshaped by someone the world had underestimated. She didn't know it yet, but her initial gesture, the simple act of walking toward him weeks ago, had triggered this cascade. A quiet spark had ignited a methodical, unstoppable fire, and the audience, the system, and even the skeptics themselves bore witness to the outcome, a triumph of intellect, strategy, and moral courage over circumstance and prejudice. Here's what that moment teaches us. Victory is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, calculated, and devastatingly effective. The world sees the result, but the careful observer understands the genius in timing, patience, and silent preparation. And as he concluded, the applause was not just for the speech, not just for the initiative, but for the transformation itself. A man who had been paralyzed physically, had risen morally, strategically, and publicly. The system had been tested, and it had been reshaped. Yet, victory always carries responsibility. The reversal was complete, but it was also a reminder. Influence, once regained, must be exercised wisely, ethically, and purposefully, and he understood this better than anyone. The silent climb had led to a public triumph. The humiliation had given way to respect. The system that had once constrained him was now being redefined by his actions. And through it all, one truth remained undeniable: intelligence, strategy, and moral clarity, when executed with patience and precision, can overcome even the most entrenched obstacles. The applause faded, replaced by a silence tinged with reflection. The auditorium had witnessed more than a speech, it had witnessed a transformation. But every triumph carries consequence, and every system that is shifted leaves ripples in its wake. The alumnus who had once mocked him now faced a quiet reckoning. No public humiliation, no grand confrontation, just the internal awareness that his assumptions had been fatally flawed. The subtle arrogance that had once insulated him was now replaced by doubt, introspection, and a grudging respect, and he was not alone. Others in the system who had underestimated the paralyzed CEO began to question their own biases, their own practices, and the unseen forces they had ignored. Here's what that moment teaches us. Transformation is not just personal, it is systemic. When someone rises with intelligence, strategy, and moral clarity, it forces others to confront uncomfortable truths about their assumptions and behavior. Change is contagious. The protagonist himself experienced a mixture of relief, pride, and introspection. Victory was sweet, yet he understood its fragility. Influence is not permanent, it must be maintained through continued clarity, resilience, and ethical action. The journey had exacted its toll. Weeks of silent planning, relentless mental effort, and the emotional weight of humiliation had tested him in ways no boardroom ever could. Yet the cost was worthwhile. The paralyzed CEO had not only reclaimed his position, but he had demonstrated a principle far more valuable than money, fame, or title: that adversity, even when layered with systemic injustice, can be converted into opportunity. Every minor victory along the silent climb had compounded into a public reversal that reshaped perception, influence, and the very structure of the environment around him. And the ripple effects extended beyond the immediate system. Junior colleagues, students, and peers now saw a blueprint for overcoming adversity. Preparation, patience, and strategic clarity are more powerful than brute strength or visibility alone. Observers who had once doubted the potential of marginalized or underestimated individuals were now forced to reconsider, to reflect, and perhaps to recalibrate their own actions. She, the mother whose small gesture had started it all, watched quietly from the back. She didn't fully realize the depth of her influence, but she understood the essence. A single act of recognition can catalyze a sequence of events that alters lives. And in this, redemption was not just his. It was shared, a testament to the unseen power of empathy, presence, and human connection. Here's the insight. Life rarely unfolds linearly. Humiliation, adversity, and systemic bias are not failures. They are data points, feedback loops, that if understood and leveraged, can guide a strategic response. The protagonist had endured the crucible, endured public scrutiny, and emerged not only victorious, but morally and intellectually transformed. Yet, as he reflected, he realized the most profound truth. Redemption is not a destination, it is an ongoing process. The system may have been reshaped, but the responsibility to maintain integrity, to mentor others, and to influence wisely remained. Influence is power, but true power is measured by how it transforms others, not just oneself. And as he exited the stage, supported by allies, the applause renewed, not for the spectacle of triumph, but for the quiet demonstration of resilience, intelligence, and moral clarity. The world had seen the reversal. Only he and a few perceptive observers had witnessed the meticulous preparation, the silent climb, and the deliberate strategy that had made it possible. The aftermath was clear. The protagonist was not merely a survivor, but a teacher, a strategist, and a model for transforming adversity into actionable influence. And in this transformation, the audience saw a lesson far greater than the triumph itself. That even in the face of systemic injustice, personal limitation, and public scrutiny, a deliberate strategic response can rewrite not only your story, but the system itself. Months had passed since the public reversal, yet the impact of that moment continued to resonate. The paralyzed CEO had not only reclaimed his influence, but had begun shaping a legacy far greater than personal success. His triumph was no longer measured in boardroom wins, contracts, or accolades. It was measured in the transformation he inspired in others and the system he helped reshape. He walked through the corridors of his institution with quiet confidence, a man who had faced humiliation, systemic bias, and physical limitation, and emerged not only intact but strategically elevated. Students whispered about him not merely as a successful CEO, but as a model of resilience and intelligence applied with moral clarity. His story became a case study, cited in classrooms, mentorship programs, and leadership seminars. Here's what that moment teaches us. Legacy is forged not in moments of comfort, but in moments of challenge. The true measure of influence is the ripple effect your actions create, the lives you touch, the systems you transform, and the values you embed in others. He reflected on the small, seemingly insignificant gestures that had catalyzed this transformation. The mother who walked toward him at graduation, offering acknowledgement without expectation, had ignited a sequence that no one could have predicted. A single human act had reminded him of his own latent power, and that lesson extended far beyond the ceremony. She didn't know it yet, but her presence had permanently altered the trajectory of a life, a system, and a narrative. And the audience, in witnessing his journey, was offered a subtle but profound lesson: the smallest acts can catalyze monumental change. The CEO now used his platform to mentor others, emphasizing patience, observation, and strategic action. He taught that brilliance is not always immediate, that influence can be built quietly, and that adversity often reveals the pathways to profound transformation. He reminded emerging leaders that challenges, whether personal, systemic, or public, are not barriers, but opportunities for insight, innovation, and moral growth. Here's what that moment teaches us. Your response to adversity, your capacity to act with strategy and integrity, and your willingness to leverage even the smallest opportunities, will define not only your success, but your impact on the world. And so, the story closes with both reflection and invitation. Reflection. Even when paralyzed, overlooked, or underestimated, the power to act strategically and ethically remains within you. Invitation. Observe, plan, and act. Turn adversity into advantage. Recognize the small gestures, the unseen opportunities, and the hidden intelligence within yourself and others. He paused in front of a classroom, addressing the next generation, not with rhetoric, but with mentorship. Here's what that moment teaches us. Life will test you, systems will fail you, and people may overlook you. But one decision, one strategic act, one clear response, can redefine everything. Never underestimate the power of deliberate action. And as the audience, real or virtual, internalized the lesson, the call to action became clear. Like, comment, and subscribe if this story resonated with your values. Share it with someone who needs to see that resilience, strategy, and moral clarity can overcome even the toughest challenges. The legacy is not in a title or a podium. It is in the transformation, the ripple effect, and the enduring reminder that a single act, a moment of clarity, or a quiet strategy can change everything. Because at the end of the day, the lesson is timeless, intelligence is never lost, influence is never gone, and the moral courage to act strategically can turn any limitation into legacy.